Have you ever looked at an iPhone and thought, how did Apple get here? A trillion-dollar company setting trends, redefining tech. But just a few decades ago, Apple was dying. And the same man who once got fired from the company would later return and save it from total collapse. This is the story of how Steve Jobs turned failure into the greatest comeback in business history.
This Apple is the original personal computer. Easy to own, easy to use.
Today will be the beginning of an alternative to IBM's vision, an alternative that starts with people rather than mainframes.
Let's rewind to the early 90s. Apple was in chaos. The company had lost its identity, dozens of products, confusing names, bad marketing, and worst of all, no direction. Competitors like Microsoft and Dell were eating Apple alive. Windows was dominating. Homes and offices and Apple's computers were too expensive and too slow to compete. Between 1993 and 1996, Apple's market share dropped below 5%. They burned through almost $1 billion a year. Even Michael Dell famously said, "If I ran Apple, I'd shut it down and give the money back to shareholders." Apple was desperate. They needed a new operating system. And more than that, a miracle. Apple decided to buy a small software company called Next for $429 million. And with it came a familiar face, Steve Jobs, the man they just fired 12 years ago. But Apple was desperate, and Jobs had something they didn't: vision. When he returned, Apple was bloated, directionless, and bleeding money. And he hated it. He once said, "Apple has some of the best people in the world, but they're doing terrible products." So what did he do? He grabbed the marker, drew a simple 2x2 grid on a whiteboard, and said, "We're going to make 4 great products, a desktop and a laptop for consumers, and a desktop and a laptop for professionals. That's it." He killed 70% of Apple's product line overnight. Printers, PDAs, accessories, clone computers, gone. People thought he was insane. But he wasn't cutting products, he was cutting distractions. That focus became Apple's new religion. Jobs' return wasn't just about cleaning house. He also brought a new culture, one where perfection wasn't optional, it was expected. If something wasn't insanely great, it didn't ship. And that mindset would soon change everything. At the 1997 Macworld Expo, Jobs stood on stage, and behind him appeared Bill Gates, live via satellite. You could hear the audience gasp. Some even booed, because Apple's biggest rival, Microsoft, had just agreed to invest $150 million in Apple. People thought Jobs had betrayed the company, but in reality, he just saved it. That deal meant Microsoft would keep making Office for Mac and support Apple's platform, keeping them relevant in the market. It wasn't charity, it was strategic. For Microsoft, it prevented antitrust lawsuits by keeping Apple alive. Jobs knew that to win long-term, Apple needed to survive short-term. That partnership between two rivals gave Apple enough breathing room to focus on what really mattered: reinventing itself. With cash in the bank and a clean slate, Jobs began rebuilding from the ground up. He restructured teams, revived morale, and most importantly, brought in Jony Ive, a British designer with a minimalist obsession. Together, they would redefine what a computer could look like. In 1998, they unveiled the iMac G3, a translucent, colorful computer that looked more like a piece of art than a machine. It had no floppy drive, no beige box. It was playful, bold, and modern. Tech critics laughed at first, but consumers, they loved it. The iMac sold nearly 800,000 units in 5 months. Apple was profitable again. And that was just the beginning. The iMac proved that design wasn't just decoration, it was differentiation. Jobs said, "Design is not just what it looks like and feels like. Design is how it works." He realized that people don't buy specs, they buy stories. They buy how a product makes them feel. So he doubled down. In 2001, Apple introduced the iPod, a simple white rectangle that could hold 1,000 songs in your pocket. It wasn't the first MP3 player, but it was the first one that made sense. It was intuitive, sleek, and came with a brilliant ecosystem: iTunes. By 2003, Apple was dominating music. Then came 2007, the year everything changed. Steve Jobs walked on stage in his black turtleneck and jeans. He smiled, paused, and said,
Today, Apple is going to reinvent the phone.
But when he revealed the iPhone, the world changed. The iPhone wasn't just a phone. It was a computer, a music player, and a camera all in one. And unlike anything before, it just worked. That philosophy, simplicity meets innovation, became Apple's DNA. It's what turned them from a struggling computer brand into one of the most profitable companies in the world. By 2010, Apple's market value had exploded from $3 billion in 1997 to over $200 billion. That's a 6,000% increase in just 13 years. And it all came from a single principle: focus on what matters. While other companies chased trends, Apple chased experience. Jobs didn't ask, what can we add? He asked, what can we remove? That's why even today when you unbox an Apple product, it feels like magic. Because for Jobs, it wasn't just technology, it was theater. Here's what made Steve Jobs different. He wasn't just the CEO, he was a storyteller. He understood that people don't fall in love with products, they fall in love with visions. He once said the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do. Jobs was obsessed with end-to-end control. From hardware to software to packaging, everything had to tell the same story. His obsession sometimes made him unbearable to work with. He'd call meetings at 2 in the morning, scream over design flaws, and demand endless revisions. But it also created a culture of excellence. When you worked at Apple, you didn't just make a product, you made a statement. That's why Apple didn't just survive, it transcended. Jobs rebuilt not just a company, but a belief system. Steve Jobs passed away in 2011, but even years later, his fingerprints are everywhere. Every iPhone design, every keynote, every product reveal still echoes his influence. Apple became the first company in history to hit a $3 trillion valuation. That's the legacy of one man's obsession, not with profit, but with purpose. Jobs didn't save Apple by being safe. He saved it by being bold. He took a dying company, stripped it down to its core, and rebuilt it with passion and clarity. That's the real secret of Apple's success. Not luck, not hype, not marketing, but the belief that technology can be beautiful. Steve Jobs once said, "Remembering that I'm going to die is the best way I know to avoid the trap of thinking I have something to lose." Apple had nothing left to lose in 1997, and because of that, it risked everything. And in doing so, it didn't just come back from the dead, it changed the world. So the next time you unlock your iPhone, remember, it's not just a piece of tech, it's a reminder that vision, even in chaos, can rewrite destiny.